Yeah, take two. Anyway, uh, I wasn't here for 2 summers because of COVID, but 3 years ago, I was wondering about topics. This is my 13th summer doing it. I ran out of things to talk about. I was going to talk about stories my grandfather told me, but I had been thinking about this one topic for a while, and 3 years ago we had a gathering for all the volunteers. And, we did all this, and there was one woman there. I don't know who she is. She was in a wheelchair. She was sitting by herself, and so I went over and I sat with her, and I told her, I said, after a while, I don't know what to talk about anymore. She said, I know what to talk about. And I said, what? And she said, sin. I said, okay, I had been thinking about that myself, and I have some experience with it. Although priests have to be very careful about eliminating sin, because if we do, we put ourselves out of business. So anyway, that's one of the topics I wanted to get at. And it's not a very popular topic. Some people say, well, we had a belly full of sin, in the past. They told us all this or that. But I'm not convinced of this. So what I want to do tonight is I want to talk just about the notion of what personal sin is and what it is not, and try to connect it with what our spirituality is about. Not just peccadillos and we did this or that, but what our spirituality is about and how that influences what we understand as sin. And secondly, I'd like to talk about what I think are big sins, and these are the systemic sins that haunt our world and we see every day on television. And then the third and final point, if we get there, I'd like to talk about the meaning of what does it mean to deal with mercy, conversion, and do we really believe in the mercy of God? I don't know if you know it, but Calvin Coolidge, one of our former presidents, was a very taciturn man. He didn't talk much. Anyway, somebody asked him one time, Mr. President, did you go to church today on Sunday? He said, yes. What did the preacher talk about? Sin. What did he say about it? He was against it. So I am too. One of the reasons this topic about sin is on my mind, in the early 70s, I came across a rather interesting book written by Dr. Carl Menninger, who was considered the founding father, really one of the great giants of psychiatry and mental health in America. And he founded the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, which is still well known. And Menninger was not a religious man, not a believer. And the title of his book was, What Ever Happened to Sin? And the reason he wrote it was he thought that acknowledging sin has a very mature characteristic to it, because when somebody finally admits that I've messed up, that I'm responsible, it's not somebody else's fault, and that I can do something about it in conversion of life, Menninger said this is very mature, well-balanced behavior, and people who deny the reality when they fetch up are people who are living in an immature way. And he thought he didn't want to overemphasize the notion of sin, but he thought there's really room for that in terms of personal responsibility, personal growth, and growth into maturity where we accept ourselves and know that we can move on from there. 50 years later, I'm still talking about the book. When you talk about sin, it's kind of hard to define. It's like, I think it was Justice Blackman one time was talking about pornography. He said, I know it when I see it. Well, this is what sin is. We know it when it happens and we see it around us. And one of the old definitions that I came across of in older moral theology was, sin is a voluntary transgression against a divine law. It's very legalistic. There's a divine law. We don't measure up to it. We screw up with it. And it's kind of over there somewhere. What I just say about this is that is not really a notion that you can find in the Old Testament nor in the New Testament. The Old Testament had words to try to describe sin, and they did it in a variety of ways. And in looking at it, then you would know it. One word that was used in Hebrew for sin, this is an interesting one. Sin is missing the mark. It's as though we're shooting at a target, and instead of the bullseye, you're over here. And missing the mark is what happens is we don't measure up, and especially we don't measure up to what is expected of us in relationship to other people. And that's an interesting notion of sin, because it just doesn't talk about God right away. It's sin as involved with other people. Another word that gets used is sin is a distorted condition of human beings when we wander from the standard that we're supposed to live by. What's interesting in that notion, sin isn't just peccadillos, or I did 3 of these and 4 of those. What it is, it's us. It's the condition in which we find ourselves. And the third word that gets used for it is sin is a rebellion, or it's a violation of the rights of others. And it happens especially when we break the covenant. And there you can see God in this. So sin could be against others. It could be we're not measuring up to our own standards, or it can be a violation against the covenant. This fourth one, this is a fourth word. It's probably over 2,000 years old, and see if it applies to today, especially maybe in the last, 5 years or so. Sin is a lie. It's abandoning the truth. It's an attack on reality, fake news, and it is folly that is stupid. I think we've dealt with this kind of sin, especially since 2016, in some massive kind of ways. You've probably seen it personified in one well-known figure. Lying, abandoning the truth, attacking reality, and folly that is stupid. But I'm not mentioning any names here. What the Old Testament also deals with is that there is a human inclination to sin. And Paul picks this up also. When St. Paul talks about sin in the letter to the Romans, he has this wonderful expression that says, "The good that I should do, I do not. And the evil that I should avoid, I do not avoid. Woeful man that I am." And when you'd say to Paul, well, where did you learn this? Did you read it in a book or anything? No. He looked at himself, and he found out that very often there's an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder. And Paul felt this pull that was sort of built into us in who we are. And this is a point I want to make. Maybe it's because I was in academics for a long time, but what we defined about sin in the Catholic Christian tradition was very much in the discipline we call moral theology or ethics. And what happened is, we had whole lists of do's and don'ts, and sins and right and wrong and all that. But it was separate over here. And there was a whole other discipline which we called spirituality. And that kind of got reduced to saying your prayers and fasting and mortifying yourself and all that stuff. But it really didn't have to do with the whole moral life. And really what has happened in probably the last 50 years, the church has been reflecting on this and saying, you cannot understand moral theology, ethical life, a moral way of living, unless you see it integrated into your spirituality. If you don't see spirituality as the basis of moral living, doing good, avoiding evil, then it is divorced from our humanity. One author put it this way. He said, sin is the unfulfillment of our life. In other words, we're living a life that doesn't measure up to the best of what we want to be. Hildegard of Bingen, she was a medieval, she was a musician, a poet, a writer, a mystic, everything. And she simply said, sin is drying up. When we just dry up within ourselves, then we're prone not to be our best, but we start leaning towards what is our worst. You may have seen this in confessional practice, which is not nearly as popular as it used to be. You remember going to confession, quite a bit. I remember getting sent out of the house, mother, get down to confession, I think she wanted to get rid of me, for a while. And on the way to church, you were thinking, what am I going to tell them this week, So you could always get by on, I forgot my morning and night prayers, okay? I forgot prayers before and after meals, so it always worked, I fighted with my brothers and my sisters, and I said hell and damn, and they wonder how many times, I did 3 of these, 4 of those, and all that. And then usually you've got some kind of a penance for doing this thing. A lot of times they came in 3s. 3 Our Fathers, 3 Hail Marys, 3 Glory Bees. If you ever got the Stations of the Cross, you never did them right away when people saw you coming out of confession, because you started making the confession. Wow, what did he do? Whew, that's a bad one. Wow. So, it used to be so frequent, and a lot of it was just act-oriented. I did this 3 times, I did that, or something else. And if you notice now, we've found it as in clergy, people go much longer now. Sometimes people go months, even years from confession. And more, instead of calling it the sacrament of confession, we call it the sacrament of reconciliation. And what it means is, you don't really change that much from week to week. You go to confession every week or every 2 weeks, but you're trying to follow the path of the Lord. And after maybe 6 months or something, you find that you started to stray just a little bit. You're not quite where you want to be. And sometimes, 6 months, a year, you look at yourself, not just individual actions, but yourself, who you are, and how you're acting. Are you acting, living according to justice and peace and love and integrity? And you find yourself over here. And when you come to confession, what you're trying to do is not just enumerate all the number of peccadillos or sins. You're trying to reconcile yourself to come back here and say, this is the kind of person I want to be. This is what my humanity is calling for. This is the growth and integrity of life that Jesus calls for his followers to live. So I use the expression sometimes people are confessing less but enjoying it more, because it is a way of really, it's truth-seeking. It's looking into yourself and saying, why am I over here when really the gospel life is calling me to be more centered here. What I'd also just like to mention to you is in this question of personal sin, the way I was raised, the way I got trained, and I think in early years, you always remember sin was defined as an offense against God, right? We broke the laws, we didn't do this or that right or something. It was an offense against God. And that's true enough. But I think more and more what we're trying to say is that we also sin against one another, not just God. If you think about the hurt that people cause to one another, that's why you have to reach out to the others, and that's why there is a conversion of life involved in this. It is so easy to hurt others. I've used this expression so many times, but it's from Maya Angelou, the writer, and she says, nobody remembers what you did. Nobody remembers what you said. But nobody ever forgets how you made them feel. And when we've hurt others, part of reconciliation is to reach out to the others. In Matthew's gospel, it says, if you are leaving your gifts if you're offering your gifts at the altar, and you recognize that you are still not reconciled with your brother or your sister, leave your gifts at the altar, go first and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come back and offer your gifts. So it's built into Matthew's gospel, and it's built into the Eucharist, that we recognize that we not only sin against God, but we sin against one another. And if you go further than that, you think about it, we sin against ourselves. If morality is to be based on a full spirituality, then part of what our spiritual life is human growth. It's growth into the potential of who we are as human beings, to find fullness, satisfaction, peace, happiness, integrity of life, all these kinds of things. And when we don't do that, we recognize that we fetch up very easily, very easily. As T.S. Eliot said one time, we are kin to the angels and the alley cats. Some days you feel real spiritual, huh? You think, oh, I've got this knocked. Oh, okay, this is good stuff. And then all of a sudden, there are other days you wouldn't put anything past yourself, because that's what the feeling is about. And you think about this, when we sin, we're not measuring up to what we are. We're drying up. St. Augustine, when he talks about sin, he says sin is being caved in on ourselves. A word we use for that today, I think, is selfishness. Usually when I have Mass, one of the prayers I put in there that free us from the selfishness which leads us to sin. It's not only free us from sin, because lots of times you can trace the sin that you commit back to your own selfishness. I don't know if it was T.S. Eliot too who said, the trouble with the world, the most of the trouble with the world is from people just trying to be too important. And I think there's a final one we're just learning, probably only within the last decade or so. We not only sin against God, we not only sin against one another, we not only can sin against ourselves, we can sin against the creation, nature, the world around us. It's no revelation to you what our future is, and what the future is for your children and your grandchildren. Don't tell me that global warming is a hoax, please. And when you think about it, there are climate deniers. There was one guy, this guy who there was mentioned before, who lies, denies the truth, and all the other things. He was faced with this. They said, sir, he lived in a great big house, great big, I forget the color of the house. It was, what was it? What was, I forget. I can't remember. Probably it was a white or something like this. And he said, you know, there's over 1,000 studies saying that global warming is a reality. It's coming there. And his answer was, well, I'm not convinced. Well, you see, that's just a way of avoiding something that's, you know, right in your face. And when you won't measure up to what the truth is, then we start putting labels on it like this is sinful. Now, one of the reasons why you talk about, you know, global warming and all of that, this is God's creation. God gave us this creation. And it's not as though, well, you know, that creation depends on us. We depend on the creation just as well. If we think there's any problem that's facing us, you think of all the, you know, the world problems that are around us. That's the big one. That's the one hanging up there. You start talking about 2030 and 2040 and all that kind of stuff. You know, all the predictions are, folks, it's going to be a changed situation. So the people who don't want to measure up to this, well, I don't know what to say about them. And you know, when you think about it in sin and all this, another thing that was pounded into my head was, you know, sin is a violation of the Ten Commandments. You could go down the whole list of this. But when you think about this, the Ten Commandments of living a virtuous way and not succumbing to sinful, distorted kinds of ways makes good human sense. If you think about the Ten Commandments, while they got there, you had 12 tribes of Israel, all trying to get along. Who got the good farmland? Who got the land close to the water? Who had enough sheep, you know? Who had the, I don't know, the prettiest wives, you know, from their tribe and all this stuff. And you had 12 groups of people trying to get along. And what they came up with was some ideas like, well, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. The Ten Commandments became just 10 good rules for living together and holding together the 12 tribes. And when they reflected on it, they said, you know what? These commandments, this is what really God wants. We're following God's will because we're all getting along and living in peace, happiness, and harmony. So in that way, folks, there could have been 12 commandments. There could have been 8 commandments. The commandments are the way of following the covenant, the way of following the gospel, the way of following God. So that's all I want to say about this first part about sin as a personal reality. If I made nothing else clear in this, I'd just like to say, remember this. There is no morality that's worthwhile without a spirituality, your personal spirituality, that engages the moral dimensions of life, of how you make decisions. Sins are not just something over there outside my life, things I got to deal with or confess. Sin is who we are in our inclinations, good and bad, all this, and the struggle we make. As Paul said, the good I should do, I do not. The evil I should avoid, I do not. So there's the exhortation for you folks. And by the way, there was this church, and they put up a sign outside the church. If you're through with sin, come on in. Somebody put a sign underneath it, and it said, if you're not through with sin, call 272-3986. So it's the devil on one shoulder and it's the angel on the other shoulder. And the second point I'd just like to mention tonight is what I call big sin or systemic sin. You know, we were all kind of raised with some notion of original sin. If you remember, Adam and Eve messed up, and then because of that, they were kind of almost perfect. They were just hanging around in the garden, having a good time, and then they sinned, and because of that, somehow, it got passed on to the rest of us. I didn't do it. And we came up with some rather silly notions of this, even from some great thinkers like Augustine, that somehow we were intrinsically evil people. Sin had vitiated us. We had inherited this sin, which was, if you remember an original sin, what they told me, it was, they drew it on it was a milk bottle, and they covered it up with chalk, and it was like, this is your soul with original sin before you're baptized. And then you get baptized, and then they erase that, and then you were ready to go. I think there were a lot of children baptized under the kitchen sink. If they couldn't wait, 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they were wondering about this because they were always wondering if something happened to the kid. Well, there was always limbo. That's before it was a dance, too. And I think that's all. It's based on the Genesis story, which we know is not a historically accurate story. It's a great mythological story with powerful teachings in it about sin, free will, responsibility. The Old Testament is quick, kind of say, after the so-called sin of Adam and Eve, what happens? Sin starts entering the world. You get murder and vengeance and war and weapons and all this stuff. You see it in, you remember Methuselah in the Old Testament? They said he lived to be something like 900 years old, and the one came after him was 800 and 700 and what? What it is, it was a way of saying that more and more as sin entered the world, people were less and less wise, so they got younger. So the age level, people are only living 500 and 400 and 300 years because sin is making the world worse. And then it got so bad, God was having a really bad hair day and decided to flood the whole world. And you remember the ark saves Noah and his family and all of that. I think we can lay that to rest. And God doesn't make junk. God created us good, imperfect, with flaws, with weaknesses. We call it humanity, but not vitiated with any kind of sinfulness. There are some church groups will tell you that no matter what you do, you're a sinner, and you never get over the sin. What happens, the grace of God just covers you over. It's like you're a rotten egg. You take a bucket and cover it over, but underneath, there's still that rotten egg there. That's not our tradition. Original sin, whatever it is, I think it goes with, it could come from John's gospel. If you remember John the Baptizer, when he first sees Jesus coming to him, he says, "Behold the Lamb of God, behold the one who takes away the sin of the world." And we do the Gloria and all that on Sundays. We talk about the sins of the world. But in the text, it's singular. Jesus is the one who takes away the sin of the world. And I think what it is the sin of the world is the human condition. It's who we are. We're imperfect to some degree. And yet, Jesus can allow us to overcome the sin of the world by giving us a way of life based on the gospel. And the more we decide to live according to that gospel life, the more we can come to the perfection of humanity. That's a large part of what grace is about. It is to bring us closer and closer to the fullness of our humanity. Our tradition for a period of time had a very negative notion of what human nature is. If you remember, St. Francis talked about his body as brother ass, just dragged it around with him. And human nature was kind of flawed and imperfect, and we had to live on a higher level with grace. I used to tell my students, if you think your pure spirit and the body and nature isn't important, try not taking a shower for a week and come back and see me whether or not you think you're pure spirit. And when I talk about big sin, it's all around us. If you think about world hunger going on right now, I mean, in Sudan, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of this country, I mean, with inflation doing what it is, they say all the soup kitchens are overwhelmed once again. It doesn't have to be that way. I think there's 500,000 people who are sold into sexual slavery, and it's still going on now, mostly women. I think of climate denial. Who's behind all this kind of stuff? It's not us. Look around. You're good people. There's no big sinners in this group. You're okay. We're all trying. But what happens when 1% of the population controls 50% of the wealth in a country? What happens when unions are weakened, when the middle class really doesn't get ahead, when tax breaks really just help the big corporations and the billionaires? It doesn't have to be that way, but what happens? Who's in control? Multinational corporations, billionaires, dictators. And what are they doing? A dictator, for example, in Brazil, he's cutting down the Amazon. It's one of the great lungs of the world. I mean, if that isn't a massive sin, if I find just climate denial and what the future is massive sin. Why? Why do we want to keep cutting down the forests and digging for more oil and all that stuff? It's for money. It's for greed. It's to keep the rich nations rich, and the poor will send them some foreign aid once in a while. One of the great prophetic messages ever to come out of the Vatican. I know, popes write encyclicals. They're not exactly bestsellers, okay? 5 years ago, Pope Francis wrote an encyclical which was a prophetic message. It's called Laudato Si. And it was a whole message on the environment. And he talked about the sin of those who are not taking the environmental damage to the world seriously. And people said to him, well, why should he talk about it? It's not his field. Stick to the rosary, stick to how many angels can dance on the head of a pin or something. And Francis boldly is saying, the people who are going to suffer the most from the future of lack of arable land and drinking water and places to live and the needs for migrations. Most of those people are the little people, the poor people, outcasts, people who don't have any resources to live on, and they do the least damage. So what Francis is trying to say, there is a moral dimension to this issue of something like global warming because it affects especially the poor, the lowly, the outcasts. And if nobody's going to speak for them, then Francis said, I'll be the one to speak up. 5 years later, it's still pretty much an unknown document. And what I can say to you about this, you say, what am I going to do about this? All the billionaires, the corporations, all of them, they get together once a year in Switzerland, in Davos. And they all talk about how we're going to get tax breaks, how we can keep the wealthy wealthy. We'll contribute some other leftover money to the little people, and we'll look like big donators. And actually, all of it is to keep the same kind of financial system going and going the way it is. 1% of the world population basically controls it. So, am I a bearer of good news or what? Huh? I do my little things, like, for the environment, I recycle, and I try not to be a consumer, and I turn out the lights, and I keep the heat down, all that. It makes me feel good, You know what you can do really about some of this stuff? Be very careful how you vote, because the politicians are the ones who can really do something about this. And they get scared of you, especially when it comes to voting time or how you spend the few dollars that you have. They're always worried about it. And you can make the changes. It's one of the significant things you can do in the kinds of legislations and all that we can do for our poor world. I don't want to get carried away here, folks. And this is just the third point I make. It's on a question of mercy, conversion, forgiveness. I don't know, we don't confess, go to confession as much as we used to, and maybe with reason. I just wanted to point this out to you. Sometimes we just don't get to it. There's fewer priests around and all this kind of stuff. Do you know at the beginning of Mass, when we have the Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy, we ask. And after that, the presider, the priest says, may Almighty God have mercy on you, forgive you your sins, and bring you to life everlasting. That's a confession. It's a confessional service. The Eucharist is given to us for sinners. Who else? And it's not automatic. What they ask people to do is, if you come to Mass and there's something bothering you, and you say, I want to change this. I want to be better at that. I've been messing up. And can you come with a real sense of looking for forgiveness, instead of even just the regular confessions? When you are there and you've examined your conscience and you've asked for God's mercy, that is a sacramental, merciful forgiveness ritual. I don't know why more people don't talk about this, but it's what the Eucharist is. Here's another question I'd just like to ask you about when we talk about forgiveness and mercy. What I find sometimes is in my ministry that people very often still are not really convinced that God could love us and forgive us. I sometimes in confession hear people telling me things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they don't still fully feel forgiven. It's almost like picking at a scab, It just never heals. You keep picking, I get a new scab, keep picking it, picking at it. It doesn't work. And I think what we talk about as sin, even world sin, and forgiveness really depends in large part on our image of God. I think sometimes people think, yeah, God loves us, but God sure gets disappointed with us in a hurry. That's not what I read in the scriptures. There's a beautiful example in chapter 38 of the book of Isaiah. And it says, when we sin and God forgives us, God takes our sin and puts it behind God's back. If you think about that, you cannot see what's behind your back. And it would mean that God doesn't see what's behind God's back. And once it's back there, it's gone. Nobody can see behind their back. With one exception, Sister Joseph in the 5th grade. She did have eyes in the back of her head. She never missed a thing. Nothing got by her. Okay, but other than that, yeah, I mean, think about that as an example. That a loving God just says, okay, here, instead of putting it in the trash can, behind his back, and that's it. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 17, how often should I forgive my brother if he sinned against me? 7 times? And Jesus says, no, 70 times, 7 times. Well, if you do the math, that's 490 times of forgiveness. 491, you're out of luck. Now, you think about this, 490 times. Married couples use up that forgiveness quotient in the first year, okay? It's the Jesus attitude of saying it's endless. It's forgiving and far beyond our man. And what we do is we take our little notions. You'll say it sometime, I'll forgive, but I won't forget. No, it's forgiven and forgotten and moved on. I've seen, a lot of the art does this to us sometimes. There's pictures of God, the wrathful king. There's some pictures of God. Looks very stern, looks angry. And even in what we've received in notions of redemption and all through Anselm, Jesus had to go to the cross to avenge an angry God. I mean, what kind of loving father does that to his son? I'm an angry God. The only thing that's going to take away my anger is you, son, go die. That's not a good notion of paternity, So what happens is the image of God will influence our spirituality, and it will influence what we think is sinful or what we think can be forgiven. Is the image of God a just judge, or is it a God who entices us? A God who summons us, says, come on this way, come on, you can come this way. And the judgment is left aside on this. Is it a God who motivates us? God who wants us to come there? I think it's probably beyond our possibilities of imagining. But we shouldn't put the limits on God. And we shouldn't be afraid, I think, either to change. If you remember in the old times of going to confession, one of the things you had to do besides confessing, you had to have a firm purpose of amendment, right? There's a little trip down nostalgia lane for some of you. A firm purpose of amendment. You're going to try to change your life. And that's the continual call, even when we sin or we look for forgiveness. And it doesn't come easy. You may remember St. Augustine, the great saint. St. Augustine sowed some of his wild oats. He had his paramour lover for a good decade or more. It was very hard to give her up. He went to the gladiatorial games sometimes with bloodlust, and he's looking, and he knew he shouldn't look, and sometimes he turned his back, and then don't look, Augie, don't look, and there he was looking, and He was involved in this. And he knew, the thing about Augustine is he knew he had to change. He knew it. He knew he wasn't the person he wanted to be, but still he had this whole lifestyle. And one of the prayers of Augustine is, "O Lord, convert me, but not right away." and this is part of this way that we come at. It's hard to let go of things. People who have gotten into a certain form, whether it even overflows into addictions, they know that they're hurting themselves. This is not what they want to be. And they know this time to change. And as you know, I think AA will tell you this, the only person you can change is yourself. It's tough going trying to change other people. You can suggest, you can help, you can intervene, you can hope, you can try, but in the last analysis, you work on yourself. That's why I think something like an examination of conscience is simply truth-seeking. We're trying to look at ourselves. I used an example a couple of Sundays ago there from Harry Potter in one of his books. And in it, Harry discovers the mirror of Ersed. And in it, it's a mirror that you look at, and it tells you exactly what you desire, what you want, who you think you want to be. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is fairest of them all? And you look at that, and I thought it'd be nice to have a mirror like that, because you can't fool yourself when you get the truth put right in front of you like that. We have choices. That's really what's before us. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said one time, "The door in hell is locked from the inside." And if you think about that, what it means is, if those in hell, for example, they can't let go of what put them there. So it's not going to be that somebody from the outside can open that door for them. It's only the person who knows how to convert can unlock the door from the inside. And let us be fully the kind of people that we want to be. I think we've done some damage to people in the past with what we've made, I think, sin out to be. Rules, regulations, do this, you can't do that, this is forbidden, we're going to tell you what to do. And it looks like it's just a big recipe book. And what it is a lot of these do's and don'ts, they're conclusions of somebody who was reasoning, all about this stuff and said, well, this is a good way to act. But what it was is we're living with things out there, transgressions, peccadillos, do's and don'ts, but not really flowing from here. It created a very legalistic system, which we're trying to move away from, just rules and regulations to say, who are we here, in here? And how can the gospel and the call of Jesus in our interior life make us the kind of people that we really want to be? I just had it happen 2 Sundays ago, just giving out communion. A woman came to me and said, I'm divorced. Can I receive? I said, yeah, sure. Took her hand, put the host in, gave it to her. After Mass, she got me, and she said, you saved me. She said, I haven't been to communion in 25 years. and I've wanted to, and now I feel I can. And she didn't stay. She didn't want to stay long. And I wanted to, who told you that? Where did you hear that? Why do you feel that way? Why do you feel there's some oppression hanging over you that just kind of controls your life, and you didn't measure up? You're a little slug here, so you don't get the good stuff here. As Pope Francis has told us, the Eucharist is not a reward for all the perfect people. It's for us, all of us who are in this. And I think of, some of the things of, you remember one of the biggies? You couldn't eat meat on Friday? You remember that? That was serious business. You did that. I asked my students one time at this, I said, why do you think Catholics don't eat meat on Friday? No, I don't know. One kid said, this is some years ago, said, well, the Pope is Italian, and a lot of the Italians are fishermen, so he thought it was really good for the Italian fishing industry that there be no meat on Friday. And I thought, whoa, it is time for a change. And you see, you remember, that's all we got. So if you wanted to eat lobster on Friday, well, it was okay, you could go with it, but if you had a bologna sandwich, ooh. Well, we know there's no meat in bologna. Okay, we know this. It's like a Spam or something like this. It's a combination of sawdust and cigarette butts. They grind it up and they put it in there. The purpose, one of the purposes of Nobody on Friday was, and Paul shows us that they took up collections for people who didn't have enough food on Fridays. And one of the things is they denied themselves meat, which was expensive. And they took the money that they saved and they bought food and they brought it to the poor and the hungry. So there was a direct connection between not eating meat on Friday and feeding the hungry. Well, it got lost. They got lost. And after a while, the only thing that was left was rules. It was a regulation. It was a sin. And the spirituality of it all got lost. It all got lost. I remember even in doing theology, it can be very academic and theoretical and all this stuff. Karl Rahner, the great German theologian, at one time said, a theologian does his best work on his knees when he's praying. And that was his way of trying to say, whatever we talk about as the Catholic Christian life, it comes from deeply within our humanity and not something that's just out there. So what do I leave you with? It's words that are close to what St. Paul's going to say Saturday. If you don't know what a prayer to say, O Savior of my soul, make me whole again. And that's what we're trying to do. Folks, I always know where the big hand is, and it's time to go. Thank you for coming. Be well. Drive safely. Thank you. Great poets demand great audiences. That's you guys out there. That's you guys out there. Be careful going home.